I'm Gabriela Fresquez, and this is Radar 2020. Last week, all eyes were glued to our digital screens and emotional support food apps. Really, it was just like any other week in 2020. Only this time, after days of refreshing our electoral maps and keeping our veladoras lit, we learned that Joe Biden is getting hired, Donald Trump is getting fired, and Melania, well, we still don't know anything about Melania, except that her body doubles are looking for work. Frankly, last week, the USA was prepared to swap its acronym with TNT, because, child, we know drama, but also because our iPhone news alerts were blowing up. Amid the escándalo, judges last week ordered massive sweeps of Postal Service facilities in search of undelivered ballots, at which point the USPS admitted that it processed at least 150,000 ballots after Election Day, jeopardizing critical votes. Then President Trump and Don Jr. set off a Twitter storm, which included calling for total war over the outcome of the election, spreading disinformation, and ultimately getting censored. And there was no shortage of lawsuits contesting elections in multiple states, many of which were deemed baseless and all came from Republicans. And then this.
They're trying, obviously, to commit fraud. There's no question about that.
This time around, there was no need for foreign disinformation, since it seems we have that covered on the domestic front. Enter 2020's Sharpiegate.
Sharpiegate.
Sharpies used at the polls.
Some Trump supporters believe that they were given Sharpies to invalidate their votes.
Fine tip Sharpies because they needed the fastest drying ink for the tabulation machines.
Filling in the Sharpie, and then it dries. We'll give it a second here, and then, oops, you can see that smudge.
Because of COVID, we all sort of knew that mail-in voting was going to be an ideal option for many voters. Knowing this, Trump called mail-in voting fraudulent early on and then encouraged his supporters to vote twice.
Let them send it in and let them go vote. And if their system's as good as they say it is, then obviously they won't be able to vote.
As my mom would say, sin vergüenza. And as expected, Democrats overwhelmingly relied on mail-in ballots. Wonder if that has anything to do with how the current administration completely politicized the pandemic. Point being, mail-in ballots take longer to count, meaning that on election night, some of us fell prey to the red mirage and the red wine. But in the days to follow, Joe's number soared. And in case you need a recap, here's how it all went down.
4 days after a record number of U.S. citizens cast their ballots nationwide, we finally learned who would be our president for the next 4 years. It wasn't the longest turnaround in history, not by a long shot, but for nervous voters, the wait was gruesome, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. To get here, Democrats knew they had to flip battleground states that went Republican red for Trump in 2016 and make them blue for Biden in 2020.
The biggest and fastest growing demographic in America, Latinos.
As well as win over states that traditionally vote Republican, casting the national spotlight on 2 Latinx heavy states, Florida and Texas. But lo and behold, it was Arizona and Georgia who surprised everyone. The 2 Republican strongholds making a flip that few saw coming. In Arizona, nearly all of Navajo Nation voted for Biden, a community hard hit by the pandemic. Also credited for the flip are sweeping demographic changes. In just the last 2 years, over 100,000 Latinx Arizonians turned 18 and became eligible to vote. Many of them bearing witness to anti-immigrant policies and rhetoric as children. In Georgia, where a recount is expected, it was young black voters who made the difference. Over 90% of them choosing Biden compared to about a third of white voters. News reports pointed to voters of color waiting hours in long lines, echoing Georgia's centuries-long history of suppression of the black vote for many. In spite of the obstacles, and as mandated through a popular hashtag, they set out to vote like their lives depended on it. And for many voters of color, it just may have.
I'ma just be real for a minute. I do not envy Uncle Joe. He's a Democrat who's about to enter office with over 10 million cases of COVID-19 nationwide, a conservative majority in the Supreme Court, a racial injustice crisis at its peak, all while dealing with a conspiracy theory-driven incumbent who may or may not have to be forcibly evicted.
Will we be president in 10 years? Only if we add a couple of terms in. Oh, now we have a story. There's your breaking news.
And long after Trump has left 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, the effects of his presidency will reverberate at the Supreme Court level. Because issues concerning whether or not religious institutions can deny same-sex couples the right to adopt, the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act, and even the future of social media are all at stake. All of these issues may likely arise in front of this now conservative majority SCOTUS. One unexpected twist that might work in Joe's favor is a Senate flip. Thanks to Georgia, there's a possibility that Democrats could reach a 50-50 tie in the chamber that Republicans have controlled since 2015. 2 Senate runoffs could make that happen come January 5th. And if it does, it would be up to VP Kamala Harris to break the ties, elevating Joe's chances of actually getting stuff done. Maybe RBG's Mike Pence fly brujeria is still working its magic. And speaking of women who've decimated glass ceilings, 2021 will be a historic year, starting with California Senator Kamala Harris becoming the 49th U.S. Vice President, the first Black VP, the first Asian VP, and yes, the first woman VP.
We did it, Joe. You're gonna be the next president of the United States.
And proving that Ginsburg's legacy isn't far from anyone's minds, women elected to Congress are also making herstory.
2020 didn't quite deliver the blue wave that many predicted. Instead, though, it's ushering in a pink wave come January. At least 137 women will be taking seats in Congress, breaking the previous 2019 record. Here's what that'll look like. At least 24 women will serve in the U.S. Senate and 113 in the U.S. House of Representatives, including 45 women of color.
I want Washington to know that the American Latino community is not the caricature that they have painted in the media.
And while some races are still too close to call, we know that at least 103 Democrat and 34 Republican women will play major roles in reforming Capitol Hill's Boys Club image.
To the Black women, the Black girls, the nurses, the essential workers, the single mothers, this is our moment.
Cori Bush will be the first Black Congresswoman in the history of Missouri. Marilyn Strickland will become the first Black representative for the state of Washington in Congress and the first ever Korean-American Congresswoman. And Teresa Leger Fernandez of New Mexico's 3rd Congressional District.
It was so emotional to actually realize that I am going to be going to Congress. I am the first Latina woman to represent my district, and I'm joining, 2 other women of color. And it's a bipartisan delegation. I think that's also important.
She'll have the opportunity to implement her progressive agenda alongside 12 other Latinx women serving in Congress next year.
And so we know that number needs to grow because our population is growing. What we need to do is our voices need to be strong. Our voices need to be unified. And I think they will be.
But women still have a ways to go for equal representation. They make up more than 50% of the electorate, yet will only make up about a quarter of Congress.
The reality is Congress is where decisions are made that impact our communities. And women of color and Latinos need to be at the table and in the rooms where decisions are being made about our communities, because we bring to that discussion the lived experience.
And if the president-elect owes anyone a debt of gratitude, it's Black women, including many Afro-Latinas. They did a full mother mic drop when it came to registering voters in multiple states, with organizers like LaTosha Brown and Stacey Abrams leading the charge.
Here in my state of Georgia, we have seen unprecedented engagement. Up to 800,000 voters have requested ballots.
Many of this year's state races are proving that we're moving in a direction where our leaders are starting to better reflect the diverse communities they represent.
For much of U.S. history, Congress has hardly reflected the makeup of the people it serves with respect to gender, race, and sexual orientation, among other factors. But 2021 is looking to make inroads on that front. For starters, 11 openly LGBT members of Congress will take office come January. And New York is celebrating not one, but two of the first openly gay black congressmen, Mondaire Jones and Richie Torres. We caught up with Torres after his win.
I never thought as a poor kid from the Bronx, I would become a United States congressman. I'm shaped by my identity as a black man, as a Latino man, as a Puerto Riqueño, as a LGBTQ person. The central mission of my life is to be the central advocate for America's largest city of low-income black and brown Americans.
He's also a big advocate for mental health.
I would not be where I am today were it not for the power of mental health care. 14 years ago, I was at the lowest point in my life. I had dropped out of college. I found myself struggling with depression and abusing substances. There were moments when I thought of taking my own life. And then I underwent treatment. And 7 years later, I became the youngest elected official in the largest city in America.
Meanwhile, the number of Latinx senators is going up from 4 to 5 after Ben Ray Lujan secured his win. The 11th generation New Mexican gave up his House seat for a Senate run, and it paid off. His state now goes on to become the first with a U.S. House delegation comprised entirely of women of color. Among them, 2 Native American women. A total of 6 Native Americans won House seats in 2020, the most ever.
But the biggest takeaway from this election cycle is, quite frankly, us, the voters. A projected 160 million ballots were cast, the highest turnout rate since 1900. Also historic was this year's youth voter turnout. As an elder millennial, I feel like a proud mama. And after all the attempts at voter suppression, millennials refuse to be deterred.
Frankly, it is very discouraging that there is a swath of our political leaders that don't want me to vote. However, just because it is discouraging doesn't mean that we're going to stand for it.
People are really starting to care, and I think that's a big part of the culture that's changing. Young people are thinking about politics, even if they aren't eligible to vote yet.
I feel excited, I feel fired up, and I feel so grateful for the organizers and activists and volunteers who have been knocking doors and making phone calls and sending text messages for months and years leading up to this election.
Data shows that over 50% of those aged 18 to 29 voted this presidential election. And these voters highly favored the now president-elect Joe Biden.
People saw the immediate threat of Donald Trump and were moved to action to organize and kind of defeat this threat with the hope of defeating this massive threat to democracy.
We knew that we were choosing not a savior, we needed an alternative to Trump, but we know that there are things that need to be answered, and we want swift and bold action from a Biden administration, so we're ready.
As for the Latinx vote, well, it looks like the sleeping giant finally cracked an eyelid, in large part thanks to massive grassroots voter outreach efforts.
Have you registered to vote? Are you eligible to vote?
And maybe also because both candidates spent nearly $30 million combined on radio and TV ads in Spanish trying to reach El Gigante.
Latinos tienen que votar por Trump. Donald Trump va a hacer un excelente trabajo.
Sé que usted está haciendo un excelente trabajo y que lo va a seguir haciendo muy bien.
Latinos tienen que votar por Trump.
¿Qué?
Donald Trump va a hacer un excelente trabajo.
Oh my gosh, ¿cuánto le están pagando para decir esas mentiras?
Whatever the reason, the fact is, America turned up. Both of them.
The bedrock of democracy is that people engage with it, that we, the people, show up and have our voices heard. So there's a lot of power in that, and there's a lot of joy from taking action for yourself and for your community and for the people you love. So I think that may have a lot to do with the unprecedented numbers.
Good morning. My name is America Ferreira. As a first-generation American, I am raising my voice to join the millions of Americans demanding a vote on comprehensive immigration reform.
For as long as I've been engaged in voter registration, getting out the vote, being on the ground campaigning in any given election or for any given candidate, I have heard so many people and headlines discuss the Latino vote and this sort of sleeping giant. But what those headlines don't often get to and talk about are the many and very real obstacles that stand in the way between the eligible Latino voter block in this country, and then being able to access the polls. There is a lot of very targeted voter suppression that is successful in keeping Latinos from using their voice. And the reality of that voter suppression should not make us feel downtrodden and defeated. The reality of that voter suppression should tell us everything we need to know about the fact that our votes have power. They have so much power. Power that people are afraid of. Power that if we used it, if our community showed up and acted on the power that exists in our numbers, people in positions of power understand that this country would change dramatically and that our voices would have to be heard if we show up and use our right to vote. And that is how I always process the fact that there are so many people trying to take away my right to vote. It's a reminder to me that my vote has power and that when I use that power, things change. I didn't always understand, what role being Latina played in my life, and that has changed and shifted as I have grown older and connected to my Latina identity in different ways. And every time I feel like, I know, what it means to me, it changes into something else. But I will say that what it has always done is give me a sense of empowerment.
Thousands of newly eligible voters in Florida also experienced a sense of empowerment in 2020. Floridians with felony records who'd served their sentences. These citizens, with the exception of murderers or sex abusers, were able to vote for the first time, all because Florida voters overwhelmingly approved a 2018 amendment. But in 2019, state legislators passed a law that interpreted terms of sentence to include payment of fines, reminiscent of a poll tax. That's when living sports legends like LeBron James and Michael Jordan stepped in with a multi-million-dollar effort to help these returning citizens pay court fees. And on the grassroots front, the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition has been working year-round to ensure these citizens' rights are restored.
The Florida Rights Restoration Coalition was originally created to address felon disenfranchisement policies in Florida. But since then, we have really developed into an organization that's been led by people with previous felony convictions, as well as those who have loved ones that's been impacted by the criminal justice system. So in addition to voting rights, we also advocate for criminal justice reform, as well as reentry and humane treatment of people with felony convictions.
Just this year, in my home state of California, a majority of voters said yes to Proposition 17, as I'm sure you're well aware, and that will restore voting rights to convicted felons on parole there. So what was your reaction to this news?
I was ecstatic, right? Because in 2018, a lot of the leaders in California, they traveled to Florida and they connected with Florida Rights Restoration Coalition. And so when Amendment 4 passed, right, that was part of their victory as well, because they played a role in helping it pass, and they got to see firsthand that directly impacted people can lead campaigns, can be strategists, and can remain at the center of a movement and be successful.
Still, one of the most surprising group of unlikely voters in 2020 was the unprecedented number of Republicans who, in a total repudiation of Trumpism, abandoned their party to vote for Joe.
Do you think it's too soon to start wearing red baseball caps again?
It's never too soon as long as you've got the right logo on it. I suppose it's always okay.
I'll just get right to it. Why did you and so many lifelong Republicans break away from your party?
Well, I think that the clear and imminent danger that Donald Trump presented made us for leftists actually with no choice. This was really an ideological fight. It wasn't about moderate versus conservative. It was frankly, I think, a fight for constitutionalism and a fight for the basic underpinnings of democracy. And so at a certain point, you have to say, it's not about my party, it's about my country. And the 8 of us decided to join in that effort and make sure that we were working to defeat Donald Trump, make sure he wasn't reelected.
What would you say to young conservatives today who don't, as it stands, feel that they have a place in politics?
Well, what I would say is you don't have a party, but you do have a place. Everyone has a place as long as we have this American form of democracy. The question becomes, how are you going to advance the ideas that you believe will make a better country and a better world? My advice to you is I would focus specifically on the issues that drive you the most. Forget the organization. Don't focus on your party. Eschew party loyalty. Be more loyal to your country, be more loyal to your values, more loyal to yourself, and find ways to advocate specifically for the issues, not the candidates and not the parties that you care about.
Another unexpected turn was Arizona, with Biden becoming only the second Democratic presidential candidate since 1948 to win the state. But the fight to turn Arizona blue began long before this election cycle. Latinxes have been mobilizing since 2010, when Maricopa County Sheriff Joe Arpaio began dutifully enforcing SB 1070, a Republican-authored piece of legislation known as the Show Me Your Papers law that encouraged racial profiling of ethnic minorities.
SB 1070 was painful, is painful. We continue to have it, and we continue to see that legislators continue to leave out the most vulnerable populations.
In response to the state's draconian and discriminatory law, the organization known as Living United for Change in Arizona, or LUCHA, began a massive effort to not only strike down the law, but to mobilize and register voters. The unintended consequence of SB 1070 ultimately energized a new generation of activists.
The big victory here in Arizona, the historic win, is our community coming out by the droves and demonstrating that our vote is powerful. And what our communities were able to do is, after 70 years, finally vote for a Democratic president, Joe Biden-elect, and Vice President Kamala Harris.
And right next door, something that won't be changing, at least in my home state of California, is the status of gig workers as independent contractors. Voters said yes to Proposition 22, siding with companies like Uber and Lyft to deny drivers benefits by classifying them as contractors. And the gig companies spared no expense to ensure their victory, running a record $200 million campaign to deny workers employment, which sounds a lot like someone paying a lot of money to avoid paying a lot of money.
How the prop was actually worded on the ballot. I mean, if you read it at face value, it's like, wow, yeah, I want to help workers, but like in reality, you're not, sweetheart, sorry. Coupled with the fact that there was this multi-million-dollar ad campaign paid for by Lyft, Uber, all these services, which is like always a red flag.
Despite this decision, it does seem like most Americans were voting with the pandemic at top of mind. Because after 9 months of COVID-19 paired with 4 years of reality TV-style theater from our commander-in-chief, many seem to be turning to a new way to cope: drugs. Last week, New Jersey, South Dakota, Montana, and Arizona legalized recreational marijuana.
I wasn't really surprised knowing that in all states where ballot measures asked Americans to reconsider the legalization of marijuana, it won, mostly because the amount of people who use marijuana, whether it's legal or illegal on a daily basis, is exponential. I was super excited, I was ecstatic, I was cursing, but mostly I was really happy at the fact that, wow, like this movement is growing. This movement is getting bigger and more states are joining.
And while the cannabis industry is dominated by white men, Latinxes are at the forefront of the movement to normalize it.
It's such a beautiful, beautiful transformation to see how a collective group of folks who really worked for decades and decades to change the minds and re-educate consumers, we're now seeing the fruits of those labors. Social justice, social equity can win elections. And it's just going to be fantastic for a lot of those minority groups who were really at risk of getting arrested, who now have a business opportunity to enter into the space. And the folks who were arrested and had records are really going to see the opportunity to expunge those records as well, so that they can be open to education and housing and loans and things like that, that really folks who were not subject to arrest are able to enjoy.
Not to be outdone, voters in Washington, D.C. decriminalized magic mushrooms, and Oregon became the first state to decriminalize methamphetamine, heroin, cocaine, acid, bath salts, Molly, LSD, salvia, all of the drugs. Pretty sure the slogan behind the drug measures in Oregon was drugs, because 2020. As stressful as elections may be for the stone-cold sober among us, we put a lot of emphasis on who's in the White House, when in reality, state legislatures are the ones responsible for local laws that have the biggest impact on our day-to-day lives. Look, my voting record isn't perfect, and I still couldn't tell you what a comptroller does, or what it is exactly, but I do know that local elections matter. America knows what's up.
When we're voting an election, we're not just voting for the president. We are voting for so many other elected officials and measures and propositions that arguably have as much, if not more, of an impact on our daily life. We're turning out to hire people to do jobs in our local neighborhoods, towns, cities, that are going to have a massive impact on our life and on our community.
In Tennessee, for example, state legislators passed a law criminalizing sharing passwords to subscription services, meaning Tennesseans can face actual jail time for giving up their Netflix passwords. And if you're a password dealer, you could be charged with a felony. Password bartering is currently the most resilient form of millennial currency. If I lived in Nashville, I'd for sure have a criminal record, and so would all of my exes. And in several states, the political party that controls the state legislature and governorship is the one responsible for how district lines get drawn, basically determining the voting power of each district. And when they abuse that power to establish unfair political advantages, the process is called gerrymandering. You know, the weird word from your 8th grade civics class that still elicits a Pavlovian response to nod off.
Founding father and Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry drew this contorted district to ensure his party's victory in 1812. One political cartoonist likened it to a salamander. From that day on, the practice of redrawing maps to find friendly voters has been known as gerrymandering.
The process allows politicians to essentially choose their own voters. Both parties do it, and it's one of the ways we engage in the popular American pastime of undermining our own democracy. And if you need another reason to pay attention to local elections, think about some of the more controversial state laws in the country. Remember stop and frisk in New York? It was Mayor Bloomberg who decided to implement it. And all those states that just legalized recreational marijuana, they did so in direct dissent of federal law. States have power, and so do its citizens, but only if we participate. I'm glad to say that the youth vote, formerly known for sleeping in on Election Day, is finally creeping out from under the covers. So now that you've swapped out the Ambien for the Adderall, keep it handy. You're going to need it for the midterms. The election ones, not the academic ones. Amphetamines are a real problem on college campuses, but completely legal in Oregon. I'm Gabriela Fresquez for Radar 2020. See you next year. I mean week. Thanks for watching Radar 2020. Please like, subscribe, and comment down below, and let us know what issues are important to you. But only the important ones, because the frivolous ones are like so 2019.